Okay, we are officially opening the session. My name is Jonathon Cohen, and I work with your Department of Energy here in the United States. I lead the Better Buildings Residential Network, a national membership program of residential energy efficiency programs and partners, and also work on other programs in the Building Technologies Office concerning technology and the solar decathlon, as well as grants and awards. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to what could be the single most important topic addressed at this conference, and that would be climate change. And we have a stellar cast of speakers to join us to share a range of views and perspectives and work that can help us gain more insight to this. This comes on the occasion of the UN Conference on Climate Change taking place as we speak, with world leaders debating the future of our planet in its climate change future. So with that, we are going to engage you early and often throughout this session. This will not be a typical session where maybe at the end you might have a question or two at the last minute. We are going to engage you and encourage your participation and questions. And so we are going to do that pretty much straight away here. So if I could ask our colleagues to cue our polling question, we are going to warm you up, as it were, and also to get a feel for who is actually here. So please vote on the following question. What is your sector? Are you government, nonprofit, business, utility, academic, or other? And we'll give people a little bit to vote. Some of you may know while you are voting that my program, the Better Buildings Residential Network, runs a regular webinar series on every topic under the sun concerning residential energy efficiency, and we do polling questions, and they are ways to get people involved early, but I also normally would have polling voting music to be able to have this pause go by so that there is no dead air, as we say in the radio business. And I think everybody's probably had a chance to vote at this point. And so we have a nice array of voting results here. We have 29% nonprofit and academic, a tie. We have right behind that government at 25%. We have business at 14%, a few friends from utilities, and one who claims other status. So that is very helpful to get a feel for who you all are. And we're now going to move on to our second poll, again, to take the temperature of the room, get you warmed up, and to get things moving. So we want you to stay near the keyboard as we queue up poll number 2, as we see poll number 1 results. And let's see if we can do that. Yeah, I'm going to click right there. So poll number 2, how long have you worked in energy, climate change, or related fields? Vote on one of the following: 0 to 1 years, that would be newbie status; 2 to 4 years, still perhaps slightly green; 3 to 6 years; 7 to 10, veteran status; 11 to 20, and then if you are in this for more than 20 years, you qualify as a grizzled veteran. So we will give you a few more minutes to vote as you do the math in your head to try and figure out how long you have actually been working on these issues. And we leave it up to you to decide what qualifies. There is no right or wrong answer, just your level of experience. And I think that we probably have a pretty good take on things right now, and the votes are in. And 25% of you are pretty darn close to grizzled status at the 11 to 20 year range. We have a tie of 19% between 2 to 4 and 3 to 6, and a tie at 13% for 7 to 10, and the aforementioned grizzled veteran, with the newbies coming in the rear at, yes, 13%. So a very good array as well in that category. So thank you very much for voting and getting everybody a little bit warmed up for today's session. And as we move on from here, I am going to now introduce our first speaker. We're going to have each speaker present for a fairly short period of time, about 6 or 7 minutes, and then we'll have 2 to 3 minutes or so, 3 to 4 minutes for a question or two before we move on. So I will start by introducing our first speaker, Dilge, and I should have gotten better feedback on pronunciation. Dilge Kanoglu-Ozkan is a managing consultant at Opinion Dynamics. And as a research and evaluation management professional, her interest lies in understanding human interactions with environmental, economic, and energy systems to identify policy and stakeholder actions that provide a more effective and strategic approach to climate change mitigation and adaptation. She has extensive experience studying energy system transformations. She's led numerous studies both in the US and in the EU, focusing on identifying social, economic, and cultural barriers to project implementation. And in addition to the research on Winter Storm Uri's impacts on Texans, she'll be presenting today. Most recently, she has led an expert interview study which served to identify opportunities and barriers for engaging community-based organizations to scale community solar in Texas. So with that, I am very pleased to turn the floor over to her to share her insights with us today. Dilge, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Let me share my screen.
We can't hear you, Dilge. You seem to be a little muted.
Can you hear me well?
There you go. That's great.
Awesome. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
All right. So thank you so much for the introduction, Jonathan. As you mentioned, I'm with Opinion Dynamics, and before that, I was pursuing my graduate studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm excited to present some of the results of the research that I did while I was studying at UT Austin here. Specifically on Winter Storm Uri's impacts on Texans. And before I start off, I want to provide a little bit of background about the events that happened in Texas. So in February of 2021, there was record freezing temperature and level of snowfall in Texas. A state of emergency was declared as over 10 million people lost power. Residents also experienced water outages, gas shortages, and price spikes, and the total economic losses of this event are estimated to be around 130 billion. And as a consequence, long-standing presumptions have been called into question about the readiness and resilience of the Texas power grid to withstand natural disasters. And Texans across the state have questioned the aspects of the state's regulatory environment. However, the true impacts of the storm on Texans are largely unknown. And so our goal was to first understand the direct impacts of the storms, the hardships faced during and immediately after the storm, and second, the actions planned for resiliency during future storms, as well as the preferences for policy and actions by utilities and local and state level authorities. And in an effort to address this information gap, we used data from a study commissioned by the University of Texas at Austin Energy Institute, where we essentially collected data from around 1,200 Texans across 4 major metro areas. So we have Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin, as well as Texans outside of major metro areas. And so to better understand the experiences of communities during Winter Storm Uri, we have to start off with discussing the impacts. So in this figure specifically, we're looking at power and water outages, as well as obstructed or inaccessible roads. And the upper portion of these stacked columns that you see here are those who experienced short duration impacts, so impacts that lasted less than a day. And then the lower portions represent those who experienced a longer duration impact, so an impact that lasted more than a full day. So looking at the figure on the left-hand side and comparing racial and ethnic disparities, we see that non-white Texans are more likely to have experienced power outages. So that's the first column that you see there. And they're also more likely to experience multi-day outages. And then looking at the figure on the right-hand side, comparing metro areas there, we see that all major metro areas experience some sort of loss of power, water, or road accessibility issues. But Houstonians specifically experienced the highest level of power outages, and Austin experienced the highest level of inaccessible roads. Austin and Houston experienced similar levels of water outages, with San Antonio faring slightly better and Dallas-Fort Worth performing comparatively well. So now we're looking at hardships. These are downstream consequences of these direct impacts that I just talked about. The main hardships that we considered break down into 3 categories. So we have day-to-day necessities, accommodation or relocation related hardships, and then work, family, and home associated hardships. I'll only focus on a handful here because I have limited time, and I'll start with clean water. So it looks like Black and Latino Texans were more likely to lose access to drinking water when compared to white and Asian Texans. Loss of drinking water access also varied significantly across metro areas. While roughly 7 in 10 Austin and Houston residents lost access to drinking water, around less than half of Dallas-Fort Worth and San Antonio residents lost access to drinking water. Though this is an important percentage, I just wanted to draw attention to the differences across metro areas here. Providing care for others during the storm also presented some hardships. So looking at differences across race and ethnicity, so the figure on the left-hand side, we see that non-white Texans experienced greater difficulty caring both for elderly and disabled members of their households, as well as children. San Antonio residents reported the greatest difficulty caring for elderly or disabled family members, and Houstonians experienced the greatest difficulties caring for infants or children. So now I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about what this actually means for how Texas communities are preparing for future crises. In this respect, we looked at a number of personal storm preparedness measures, so things like creating an emergency plan, having emergency food or water supplies, as well as some home firming measures, so things like buying a backup generator, installing solar panels, or weatherizing homes. And so looking at the results of all the potential resiliency measures that we looked at, we see that creating an emergency plan by far had the greatest level of support. Around 2/3 of Texans indicated that they're likely to create an emergency plan for future crises. And we also wanted to understand the factors that actually impacted planned storm preparedness actions. I don't want to get into the details of the modeling that we did here, but we can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. But I just want to simply discuss some high-level findings here. So Texans who experienced water outages and obstructed roads have an increased likelihood to purchase emergency food or water, or to create an emergency plan. Texans who had a power outage or experienced obstructed roads are again more likely to buy a home battery system or a backup generator. So essentially, those who experienced greater impacts related to the storm are preparing themselves as well as their homes for future crises. Texans who were able to leave their home for other shelter, on the other hand, they're less likely to purchase emergency food or water. So essentially, having some sort of support mechanism allows them to feel more confident about handling future crises. And then looking at transportation, we see that individuals who dealt with inoperable personal vehicles expressed greater interest in purchasing backup generators, and individuals who experienced loss of transportation due to stoppage of metro transit services are more likely to install solar PV, weatherize their home, or purchase home battery systems. Renters understandably differ from non-renters regarding home firming actions, especially given that some of these require long-term property investments. And so as a result, we see that renters are less likely to purchase battery systems or weatherize their homes. And finally, I'd like to turn to the question what Texans actually want state policymakers to do in response to future crises. So we looked at several policy proposals, including but not limited to requiring ERCOT board members to reside in Texas, adding more renewable energy to Texas's energy supply, and requiring energy providers to weatherize their facilities. And as one might expect, political party affiliation heavily influences the policies Texans do or do not support. But it looks like Texans overwhelmingly support requiring ERCOT board members to live in Texas, irrespective of their partisan position. And around 3/4 of Texans actually ended up supporting this policy proposal. We found that direct storm impacts had nearly no influence on the policy proposals that we looked at, with one exception, that being experiencing obstructed roads, resulting in an increase in support for having a statewide disaster alert system. Looking at hardships, on the other hand, we see that Texans who could not go to work and lost income had greater support for having higher energy reserves and government funding for weatherization. Support for requiring weatherization is also higher among those who face difficulties caring for members of their households. On the other hand, Texans who were actually able to continue to work during the storm, or those who were able to leave their homes for other shelter if they needed to, are less supportive of requiring higher energy reserves. So yeah, I tried to summarize what happened in Texas, the resulting hardships faced to the extent that I could, given the limited amount of time that I had. But I just want to say that I believe the richness of the data set that I talked about today lies in its ability to provide direction for further research that could help us better understand why there are differences across communities and how that might influence how we can better serve diverse communities in Texas as we prepare for future climate disasters. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, but before I do, I just want to take a moment to recognize the contributions of other researchers to this research. Even though I'm the one presenting the findings here, this was a group effort.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dilge. Really appreciate that very informative and insightful presentation. And we have time for a question or two before moving on. And we have a few questions in the chat. Chris asks, did the survey, or the people you engaged, have opinions or knowledge about whether renewables were the glitch or fossil fuel power plants?
Unfortunately, we didn't ask any questions related to that because this was the questions that we asked were part of a larger survey conducted in Texas. So we weren't really able to gauge whether they had any information regarding what actually caused the winter storm. But yeah,
Okay.
that would be a great addition.
Yeah. We also have a question before we move on from Claudia, who asks, she would love to hear specifics of drinking water loss, as in, was it attributed to wastewater treatment plants or breaking pipes, combined sewer systems, etc.?
Well, the question was more general about access to clean drinking water. It included all these different elements that Claudia mentioned there. But we weren't able to break apart the different causes of access to clean drinking water during the storm, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. We really appreciate the questions and your answers. And in the interest of time, we're going to have to move on, but we will have breakouts immediately following the speakers where you have opportunities to engage them further with other questions and thoughts. So do stay around for that. We're now going to move on to our next speaker, and Jim Dodenhoff is a passionate energy and sustainability expert with over 25 years of successful experience in the energy and environmental services industry. He's worked for a broad group of market participants, including microgrid control solution providers, energy and advisory consulting firms, electric utilities, recycled product manufacturers, and environmental service firms. Jim is currently principal of Silent Running, a California-based energy and advisory firm that focuses upon renewable energy project development, energy efficiency program management, and equity in clean energy programs. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Jim. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? And can
Yes,
you
we
see?
can.
And can you see me? And can you see a slide that says the New World and has a big fire on it?
I can see you, but not your slides.
Okay. I am sharing my screen.
And there you go.
Okay, great. Okay, let me get rid of this and we will jump in. Greetings from California. I'm going to address the challenge of minimizing wildfire risk from and to electrical infrastructure. So this first slide is kind of an overview slide. It provides a listing of the largest wildfires throughout the world in the 21st century, sorted by footprint of area burned. And I guess I'd ask you to kind of go down there. The yellow highlighted one is are really ones that I looked at very, very closely and got detailed information on, but kind of begs the question, you know, what are the right parameters to look at a wildfire or a bushfire around? Size is certainly one, but how about lethal? You know, how lethal is a fire? How many people died directly and how many people died indirectly from smoke inhalation, something like that. How destructive is a fire? What's the property loss? What's the animal loss? What's the habitat loss? How costly is a fire? What amounts of money are spent or economic opportunities lost when we have a wildfire? How much environmental damage is created by the fire itself? GHG emissions, for example, are absolutely staggering from some of these larger wildfires. There's watershed loss, air quality degradation, and biodiversity degradation. And then, you know, kind of the focus of this presentation is what caused the fire. And what it turns out, that's not such an easy question. You have to map to all the phases of a fire, namely ignition, subsequent growth of the fire, full development, and decay. I want to focus first on the Black Summer wildfires in Australia, which occurred in 2019 and 20. The acreage burned was about 72,000 square miles, equivalent to the size of the state of South Dakota for folks from the United States. Fatalities were 34 direct and 445 indirect through smoke inhalation. Lightning was the major cause of ignition. However, the historically high and dry conditions at the time exacerbated the destruction from the fire. And this, I think, is some of the most interesting information. CO2 emissions from this event alone were 715 million tons. And in a quote, normal year in Australia, CO2 emissions are about 535 million tons. So you can see the magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions created by these fires. A little closer to home, I'm based in Southern California, looking back at all the fires we've had in the last 20 years. 9 of California's 10 wildfires have occurred in the last decade, and the 8 largest have burned since 2017. Over the past 10 years, 1 of every 8 acres in the state has burned in a wildfire, double that of the previous decade. I've also included detail at the bottom there on the Camp Fire, which, as it turns out, is actually not one of the top 20 largest fires in California, but certainly the most deadly and the most destructive, and probably one that's kind of the most infamous. It was started by a failed transmission line and just created immeasurable damage and death. So for this slide, I kind of dive in a little bit and provide a mapping of wildfire causes and wildfire stages. On the left-hand column, the fire life cycle stage, I kind of provide the primary stages of fires, namely ignition, growth, the fully developed burn, and then the decay, which the decay being the longest portion of a fire. The remaining columns, the lighter yellow, are some of the main causes of wildfires and the degree to which these causes or origins impact each phase of a wildfire. So, you know, what causes wildfires? What I found in my research is what's a seemingly simple question is in fact quite complicated. In California, less than 10% of wildfires are actually caused by electric infrastructure. Lightning causes roughly 15 to 25%. Man-made arson and man-made accidental causes comprise another 15 to 25%. But the largest direct cause of wildfires is either unknown or unable to be determined. Digging a little deeper, a significant driver for the ignition of a fire may not necessarily be a key driver for the fire's growth and fully developed burn. So I would put something like lightning into this category. Fuel loading, on the other hand, may not be a particularly significant ignition driver, but it can be the main driver behind the fire's growth, spread, and destructiveness. And finally, as it relates to climate change, extreme heat, wind, and drought have an important impact on all phases of a wildfire, as you can kind of see from the chart. Electrical infrastructure failure, electric infrastructure failure, arcing or sparking is certainly a driver for ignition and growth, but is not particularly significant to a fire's full development. I guess the point I'm making is that climate change creates an environment, namely extreme weather events and conditions, which magnify the burn potential for these ignition events and which can amplify the intensity of fire growth and heat release for a given wildfire. Finally, as you can see in the hot off the press square, I provided a reference to a very recent article. It actually came out yesterday by some California researchers who found that regular weather patterns explain a relatively small portion of California's extreme weather events, and that climate change is a much larger explanatory factor, ranging from 60 to 80%. So check that out when you get a chance. I've not read the article completely, but quite timely. This slide presents an array of the most widely used tools for trying to reduce wildfires started by electrical infrastructure. The color schemes I use are evaluative and directional. A green shaded tool is at least somewhat effective in taking on the challenge. A red shaded tool indicates a lack of efficacy, feasibility, or provability. My research indicates that microgrids and distributed generation are not the end-all be-all solution for mitigating wildfire risk, especially since so many microgrids will remain grid connected. Conversely, my research could find little evidence that public safety power shutoffs, or PSPSs, provided material wildfire mitigation, and significant evidence that in a context of extreme weather events, cutting off access to electricity introduces additional hazards to end-use customers. I should note that also PG&E has proposed undergrounding some of its T&D infrastructure in high fire risk areas. The cost of this infrastructure is roughly 5 to 10 times that of overhead lines. Undergrounding is generally implemented in urbanized rather than remote area and bundled with other infrastructure. PG&E's proposal to underground a portion of its T&D infrastructure is neither feasible nor credible in my view. Ultimately, climate change mitigation is the best long-term tool and the umbrella under which wildfire risk can be reduced. And finally, circling back to the challenge that we started at, I would offer some closing thoughts. One, there's a considerable ambiguity around wildfire risk mitigation measures and their efficacy with respect to electrical infrastructure. How do we know our measures are actually working? Public safety power shutoffs are primarily a liability mitigation measure for utilities and their regulators. Point three, the C&I distributed generation market is being driven by PSPS risk, in California at least, and energy independence as much or more so than by wildfire risk. End-use customers are more afraid of PSPSs than wildfires and are seeking certainty of service and cost. Last, but certainly not least, climate change plays a central role in the escalating number, severity, and destructiveness of wildfires around the world. Climate change creates conditions where electrical infrastructure ignition risk is higher and fire-specific destruction is greater. We remain a long way from utopia, in my view. And with that, I'll pass the baton. Look forward to addressing any questions or seeing you in the briefing room. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Jim. We really appreciate that presentation. Really informative, very visual, and we have a question in the chat. I encourage others to put their questions in the chat while we have a few minutes right after. We want to give you an opportunity to ask questions while presentations are fresh in your mind. So Jim, we have a question in the chat. Could you please describe more fully why undergrounding is not a good solution?
I can, but I think you come to the briefing room. It's the completely wrong tool for the job, and I think, as I said in the presentation, where we see undergrounding is primarily in urban areas, and when you put things underground, you subject them to being hit by humans, you subject them to being flooded. It's not necessarily safer from a resiliency standpoint than the alternative, and the cost is just ridiculous. Orders of magnitude. I would argue strenuously that there are other solutions. I didn't talk much about vegetation management that are far more cost effective and simply not necessarily nearly as costly to ratepayers ultimately as undergrounding.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We have another question in the chat before we move on, and the question is, what is the source of your information concerning C&I DER adoption mainly driven by desire for avoidance of PSPS events?
Living in California, talking to my clients, I don't think you can necessarily parse out why individual folks make specific decisions, but certainly in the marketplace that I work in, people are far more concerned about having their power shut off for 2 or 3 days and not really understanding why or when. And most people operating large businesses are generally, or many people operating large businesses are generally in urbanized areas. So I just don't see wildfires themselves as being a major driver today for adoption of grid-connected microgrids or just not grid-connected microgrids.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And for those chatting in questions, we have a comment that applies, which is please keep the acronyms to a minimum. I work for the federal government, so I am steeped in acronyms, but others do not have the overwhelming number of acronyms we do in the federal government. So please do spell out your questions. And one last thought that is mentioned in the chat, which I want to share. Somebody asks, are all the presentations going to be dystopian? Looking forward to some hope from some utopian presentations. So we are setting the stage here with our first presentations, clearly articulating some of the issues and problems, and I think we will have more to follow on that. But I think that is going to close out our question time for Jim. Jim, thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate everything that you had to share, and certainly a lot of food for thought. And so now we're going to move on to our next speaker, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Daniel Sloot, who is an environmental psychologist whose work focuses on sustainable behavior in the energy transition. He has conducted research on people's participation in community energy initiatives. He works as a postdoctoral research associate at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany, where he joins us today. In this role at the chair of energy economics, he conducts research on the acceptance and adoption of demand response programs in an interdisciplinary setting together with economists and engineers. In collaboration with a major national utilities company, he is currently part of a project investigating consumer flexibility in local electricity grids. Daniel's research has been published in a number of scientific journals, including Global Environmental Change, the Journal of Environmental Psychology, and Energy Research and Social Science. I'm now going to turn the floor over to him and encourage people to chat in their questions as you are listening to his presentation. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel, and thanks for that very nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen as well. Okay, you can all see that now. Okay, yeah, I don't know if my presentation can be more utopian than the other ones, but probably a bit less dystopian than wildfires. I think that much I can promise. I'd like to talk to you about a meta-analysis of financial incentive interventions to promote residential energy behavior, specifically energy conservation in households. I've been developing this with my colleague Benjamin, also from the KIT, currently writing up this paper, so hopefully you can read a more in-depth account about this very soon. I think we're all familiar with energy conservation programs, come in a very wide variety of types, but probably financial incentives are one of the more popular approaches to encourage households to conserve energy. And that, of course, implies that we should have a very good idea about whether those incentives actually work. So financial incentives, think, for example, giving people cash rewards for a certain amount of percent of energy that they save, pricing electricity at different levels at different times of the day, for example, but also just giving people financial information such as cost feedback. And actually, there are some meta-analyses out about this topic of well, different interventions, including financial interventions and energy conservations. But the evidence so far, I think, is actually a bit ambiguous. So, for example, there's an analysis by Maki and colleagues concluding that incentive interventions had a small to medium effect on behavior. So that would be a more optimistic take. On the other hand, you have a recent analysis that says pricing strategies have no significant effect and monetary information actually increases consumption. And I could, I think, give you 2 or 3 more examples for each of those 2 sides here. And that sort of led us to develop another meta-analysis that aims to go a bit more in depth into this question of whether financial incentives are effective. And here we focus on financial incentives. So we actually want to look at, well, what are the conditions under which financial incentives are effective? We probably have different types of incentives, different types of behaviors. And so that's what we sort of like aim to do with this analysis. We did a literature search on this, included 66 studies with 103 effect sizes in total. And something we did here that I think hasn't been done in previous studies is that we actually looked at 2 types of energy conservation here in the same analysis, but also sort of tried to distinguish and disentangle that a little bit. Where most studies have focused on incentives that promote overall energy conservation. And that's what you can see on the left side figure here. So you give people an incentive, and that's supposed to promote some reduction at any point in this time that the incentive is in place. It doesn't really matter when, so it's just about the overall reduction in consumption. And another type, though, and I think that's something that has become a bit more popular more recently, is encouraging energy conservation at specific times. So encouraging households to be more flexible in their energy usage. And that's what we refer here to as peak load reductions. So the peak load, you can see there's usually sort of a peak in the demand curve over the day. And these incentives are specifically targeting this peak. So households should reduce their energy consumption at these peak times, but they can obviously then shift that consumption into the off-peak times, into these valleys that you see here on the sides of the graph. And so we looked at those 2 types, and you can see here this showing the studies that we included by publication year. You can see there was quite some early research in the 1980s, mostly on overall consumption, and then there was sort of like a 20-year gap where not much happened really, and more recently, post 2010, there were more studies coming out again, and a lot of those now also focus on peak consumption more recently. So we first looked at the overall effect size. So across all types of financial incentives and across these types of behavior, we find that energy consumption is reduced by a bit less than 8%. So I guess that's something. You can see the confidence interval here is also pretty small. But you can see that I sort of like put the dots in here for the individual observations. And the green color always refers to studies on overall consumption, and the red orange color here refers to studies on peak consumption. You sort of like get an idea that peak consumption studies here seem to produce slightly larger savings effects. And indeed, if we disentangle that and look at these two types of conservation separately, we see that that's indeed the case. So we see that the savings effect for these financial incentives that target overall reductions in consumption is actually then becoming quite small, about 3%, whereas there's a much bigger effect for studies targeting peak consumption at about 10%. And still here, you see we could explain some of this variation from the left side of the graph, where we had all studies included, but there's still quite a large variation in terms of how much conservation these incentives can achieve. And so in the next step, try to go a bit deeper. So these again are only studies focusing on overall consumption. And here we now looked at what type of incentive is actually used. So a lot of them just provided sort of like financial information. Often it was cost feedback on how much money people actually paid for their energy consumption, and hope that that would encourage them to save more energy in the future. And you can see that that's actually not very effective. So the mean effect here for these incentives providing financial information is very close to zero. And in fact, the confidence interval overlaps with zero. So those do not reliably lead to actual savings effects. If actual incentives are provided, so for example, a cash reward at the end of the program for a certain amount of energy that's saved, that's a bit more effective. You can see here on the right-hand side. And then we looked at different types of peak incentives as well. And so peak incentives, like I said in the beginning, are mostly pricing strategies. So different types of pricing. I'd like to go a bit more into detail here, but I think the time is very limited, so I'll just be very brief with this. But you can see there are different types of pricing, such as time of use pricing or critical peak pricing, and they too have very different effect sizes. So time of use pricing, for example, on the very right side here, has a rather small savings effect, whereas other types of pricing, critical peak pricing, produce much bigger savings effects. And so to conclude this, in this short presentation here, you can see that there can be savings effects coming out of financial incentives that are provided, but it depends a lot on what sort of incentive you use, how it is used, and what type of behavior it actually targets. And I think we should keep that in mind when we design those future programs and policies to achieve the highest savings that we actually can achieve. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. We really appreciate that presentation and the work that you've been doing researching these important issues. And now is the time for people to chat in their question for Daniel while his presentation is fresh in your mind. And I'm going to go to the chat right now for a first question from Dr. Reuven Sussman. He asks, are the reductions referring to overall reduction for all studies, or are you reporting peak reduction for the peak reduction studies and overall reduction for the others?
Yeah, so the second is the case. Sorry if that's a bit confusing. We've actually been thinking quite a lot about the terminology here. And if you have any input in this, I would appreciate that, because the paper is not submitted yet. So overall, indeed, does not mean all studies, but overall means the studies that specifically focus on the savings that sort of like are general savings. That's what overall means here. And the peak studies sort of are the other half of the studies that focus on peak savings. I hope that's clearing it up a bit.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Leah who asks, pardon if what is pardon if I missed this, what is a monetary information strategy?
So a monetary information strategy is basically a strategy where people don't get direct cash incentives, for example, or cash rewards for changing their behavior, but they are sort of getting feedback, I guess you could call it, for example, cost feedback, in which they are told how much they actually, well, how much energy they're using and how much that's costing them in their monthly or weekly energy bill, whatever it is. And the hope is, I guess, of this sort of strategy is that if you tell people how much they're spending, you focus them on the potential for savings, and that is supposed to change their behavior.
Okay, thank you. And a question about your premise about financial incentives not being necessarily the ideal to motivate behavior change. It's common wisdom in energy efficiency programs that pain is a motivating factor. You know, there's the stick and there's the reward carrot, and then there's what gets us off the mark. Because few people want to, particularly in the residential side, they're not looking forward to inviting people to come into their house and do work and that inconvenience. Could you share some thoughts on the role of discomfort, for example, aside from the financial side in your work?
Are you talking about the discomfort that could be caused by conducting these studies? Is that?
I'm sorry, no. In terms of, you were addressing financial incentives in terms of efficiency of work getting done, in terms of like what motivates people. If they're not responding to financial motivations, what motivations are they responding to?
Okay,
or
yeah, I think that's a great question. And actually that's what some of the meta-analyses that I referenced in the beginning have been looking at. So they've sort of taken a more overarching perspective on comparing different intervention strategies, including financial strategies, but also including behavioral strategies that are not financial incentives. So some others, for example, are social norm approaches, where you give people normative feedback, their electricity usage compared to what their neighbors use. There are also modeling approaches, for example, where good energy behavior, I guess, is modeled. There are prompts. So there are a bunch of other types of interventions that have also been used and also shown some potential.
I'll also add that a comment in the chat questions whether the monetary incentives just were not big enough to motivate people. Although I will add anecdotally from grants that I have worked on, if financial incentives were too big, people thought they were too good to be true, and so did not take them up. There was a sweet spot of the right amount that was tested by a grant that I had during the Recovery Act that found that, for example, with interest rates for loans to help people get work done, that 0% was considered too good to be true. And 1 to 4% actually had better take up. So counterintuitive, but there you go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
It's a great point. So yeah, other incentives not large enough. I think there is something to that. I have to say I don't really know based on our data. We try to look into that as well and try to look at whether there's a correlation between how large the incentive is and how much energy is saved. But it turns out that it's actually really difficult to do just in terms of measurement, because it is very difficult to standardize these very different types of incentives into a measure that actually is comparable in a way. But it is, if you look at the sort of theoretical underpinning, I think that is one criticism that if you give people financial incentives, you focus them sort of psychologically on this very narrow cost benefit analysis, right? So like, how much do I get? What's the incentive that's offered to me, and how much is the cost of changing my behavior? So that's what the incentive might do. And then what we see, I think, in a lot of cases is that when it comes to saving energy, the sort of like amount of money you can pay out for a certain amount of kilowatt hour savings is just not very much. So I think oftentimes people realize that in a month with a certain amount of behavior change, they might be able to save $1 or $2 or so. And they might just conclude that that's not enough to actually make it worth engaging in this behavior change.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. We've got a few comments in the chat, and one last question that I'll ask Daniel for a quick answer on before we move on. My reference to interest rates was from a grant, was not a study. There is a write-up on some of that work. If you search Better Buildings Neighborhood Program, Michigan, you hopefully will find it on a website that has some cases profiled there, if not just message me and I'll be happy to share that with you. On-bill was not a consideration in those efforts, as somebody has asked. So last question, very quickly, please. Could you share, Daniel, in general, what motivates people to act, utopian or dystopian outcomes?
That is a very general question. And I'm wondering if I should answer this in the context of financial incentives in particular, trying to find the right angle here. I mean, generally, I would say that utopian outcomes are probably a much more motivating force for change in dystopian outcomes. So I think that creating a sort of desirable utopian image that people find realistic and realistic to achieve, I think that is probably a pretty good lever to motivate actual change, I would say.
Okay, and there you have it. We have utopian trumping dystopian in the session. So somebody had asked where we were going to fall down on that count. There you go. We have, at least from one speaker, an answer. Daniel, thank you very much. We really appreciate that presentation. Thank you for the questions. We're now going to move on in the interest of time to our next speaker. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ruth Ann Norton, who is President and CEO of the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, having joined the organization back in 1993. Affectionately known as GHHI, the organization is dedicated to addressing the social determinants of health and racial equity through healthy housing. Ruth Ann is an expert on lead poisoning prevention and healthy housing and directs GHHI's national strategies, technical assistance, and direct services to advance housing as a platform for improved health, economic, educational, and social outcomes for low-income communities. The organization works in partner jurisdictions, nationally implementing a model built on a framework of cross-sector collaboration that integrates lead hazard reduction, healthy homes, and energy efficiency interventions. Ms. Norton has been at the forefront in building the business case for healthcare investments in housing and helped lead the development of the nation's largest hospital community benefits investment in healthy housing, and is currently working to implement a groundbreaking partnership with a national healthcare organization to produce 7,000 healthy and energy efficient homes in 7 cities over the next 3 years. Research publications on energy equity and the non-energy benefits of energy efficiency, including the recently released Leading with Equity and Justice in the Clean Energy Transition. And she has numerous leadership roles and far too many accomplishments to list here in our limited time. But with all of that, I think it's very obvious what a prominent position she has in the field, and we are very appreciative to have her spending time with us today to share her insights. So Ruth Ann, thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours. Over to you.
I am always happy to be with you, Jonathon, and the Department of Energy, especially now as we're looking at historic investments coming to climate. And where we work, for the audience, I think it's pretty clear, but we work at that intersection of energy efficiency, carbon reduction, and electrification in the home. Our goal in making healthier housing in America, including the reduction of lead poisoning, reduction of asthma, trip and fall injury, is grounded in our work to bring climate and climate change to individuals in the lowest income communities through improving their homes through retrofits. And doing so, we will and do address the social and structural determinants of health, and to address our nation's need to get right and fast on racial equity. What wakes us up and challenges us every day are the 30 million American households that are living in unhealthy conditions, where there is a cross sector of poorly weatherized housing, where there is exacerbation of lead-based paint, and through that poor weatherization, increased incidence of asthma, which leads to the greatest missing of school and ill preparation of our kids through lead poisoning and asthma, but also trip and fall injuries that cost us a lot of money in this country through our Medicaid and Medicare programs, And it is all interlinked and grounded in the energy efficiency and weatherization of households, impeding generational wealth transfer and other avenues, including, as I said, education. So back in 2009, we moved our work, which was often being done in silos, to an aligned, braided, and coordinated process that aligns philanthropic, private sector, tech, banking, and healthcare investments to align with government programs to strengthen that work, fill the gaps that were not and often are not getting funded, and use the opportunity of programs like weatherization, assistance, lead hazard control, and others to really make comprehensive change in housing structures. So we change the normal for America's lowest income communities, a normal where people expect their kids to get sick, injured, and families to be derailed and destabilized because of their housing condition, and instead use it as an opportunity to create cost savings in health and healthcare, and to reinvest those cost savings that you'll hear about in the work. And that includes having done about a decade's worth of work of convincing our healthcare sector that climate change and the housing crisis as it intersects is work that should be invested in by healthcare because it can advance healthcare. Some of the early work that we started on this was with NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, in helping them to address health and safety issues that needed to get done in order that we could do proper weatherization, energy efficiency. We showed that in fact, 62% of the time in many of America's major cities, we were deferring and declining our lowest income families who needed weatherization most because we weren't taking care of the issues of lead, mold, mildew, moisture, and structural defects. So we created a grant program for NYSERDA to remedy that through their work. In Connecticut, today they released an RFP for $12.1 million. That is a reflection of the work that we did with 7 agencies that coordinated health, housing, Medicaid, childcare, aging, and the work of the Green Bank. And in California, we just recently achieved a great milestone where our work in looking at the health of housing and building a pathway through Medicaid is now going to allow California residents who are on Medicaid or Medicare to receive up to $7,500 to improve indoor air quality and other issues that trigger asthma. In fact, 40% of American emergency room visits and hospitalizations are caused by unhealthy and lousy housing conditions, according to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Commission on Building a Healthier America. We've also been working with healthcare to show them how that investments in occupied housing through energy efficiency, lead, asthma, and injury can really improve their work on the social determinants of health and what was formerly uncompensated care, and moving this into proactive investments to improve the health of their client base and the trajectory of the client base. And you can see many of the entities we're working with, but a couple of key examples where this intersection has been so great. Like the city of Santa Clara, California, which is not up here, just recently adopted a climate change initiative. And the forefront of that is to do lead poisoning prevention, which many people would not connect because they know they need to do that in order to do energy efficiency, weatherization, and electrify housing. They have to address the toxins in the house first. But closer to where I am in Baltimore, University of Pennsylvania just used a hospital community benefit vehicle, which all nonprofit hospitals in the United States have to invest in community health through hospital community benefits. They've invested $50 million to de-lead housing in alignment with weatherization and other monies that will come to housing being a linchpin issue, $50 million in a county of less than 500,000 people and at a main city of less than 90,000. With ProMedica, one of the nation's largest Medicaid managed care organizations, we are launching a 7,000 unit healthy housing program where we are investing energy efficiency and climate carbon reduction dollars with lead and asthma reduction and fall prevention for vulnerable children and seniors as a means of not only creating opportunities and intergenerational wealth transfer and addressing our racial disparities, but to advance the data on why healthcare benefits from investments in remediation like or repairs that include weatherization. We've also expanded the use of unused administrative dollars under the Children's Health Insurance Program to address lead, asthma, and other healthy housing aspects as a pre-weatherization opportunity, and where it crosses into indoor air quality and weatherization on the asthma and respiratory disease front. And in Michigan, we have created a new fund modeled after the Michigan Saves Climate Fund to mirror that with funding for lead poisoning prevention and healthy housing. And it has actually a $12 million starting investment from the governor's office and legislature, and it is designed to grow to $750 million of investment. So we're using these healthcare dollars to address our issues of climate and health. And as Jonathon said, I really encourage people who are looking at that intersection of our crises around climate and housing to read the paper that we just wrote on leading with equity and justice. How do we ensure that low-income communities are brought along in the energy efficiency and weatherization and climate carbon reduction framework, are not left behind, but also with the caution that with electrification, we have to be mindful, careful, and strategic about doing this, because we could drive up the energy burden rather than drive down economically. And so we are looking to build solutions around that. We're working in states like Maryland, New York, and in the Northeast through National Grid, also to incorporate work on health and racial equity in all of the climate and energy work that intersects with housing. And in the US, governors and mayors are currently now actively making decisions on billions of dollars that have come through the American Rescue Plan Act funds that allow investments in whole house approach to energy, lead, asthma, to really create an aligned and integrated home remediation pathway. In New Jersey, we're working through the Board of Public Utilities to bring together their housing and health agencies and their environment work into a single stream investment in the repair, lift of standards of occupied housing. And in the city of Milwaukee, Mayor Tom Barrett and the Common Council have adopted almost close to $90 million to address health-based housing issues and climate and energy efficiency to create a single stream and sustainable investment building to that pathway to allow for healthcare to come in, utilizing the cost savings created by these investments to reinvest in more housing and build a greater platform. So this is a fast growing area. And in one of the areas that we've been trying to add in to this work as we create greater investment from healthcare is also the opportunity that when we are in housing, we are not only looking for lead or looking for asthma, but one of the most prevalent things that we see when we conduct a comprehensive assessment looking at resident health and energy and health-based housing status is injury, trip and fall injury hazards. And it's an extraordinarily high preventable expense in the United States with a high death rate that is not really captured in our ability that we have at hand to invest together and really drive down this $255 billion in avoidable cost. But mostly we want to prevent those 20.7 million injuries and those 74,000 plus deaths that we can prevent by looking at the structural defects that are often minor home repairs while we are in the home conducting comprehensive assessments. And this includes things like fire and burns as well, and caring for toxins and the like. So with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and Hopkins, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, we are moving forward the use of it's called a CHASE tool, preventing injuries to children through home safety audits and modifications, and integrating that into the work that we're doing in foster care, in the private sector, in order to look at this. And so taking that $1 million grant and coordinating with our Department of Human Services here in Maryland, the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and AmeriGroup, another one of our Medicaid managed care partners, we're looking at how do we best move forward with our study team, really to improve safety while improving climate, while improving other aspects of health. And this has been pre-tested already in about 171 cases, and where Hopkins looked at this tool and utilized this predictor analysis that allows us to then make proactive and preventive changes. So now we are looking to do 300 homes for families who are low income in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And to determine those cost of injury measures and add that into our calculation of not only our upfront costs, but our return on investment into the healthcare systems, into the ability to get kids in the classroom, healthy, ready to learn, housing stability, and other issues that come, and looking at also the barriers that may exist in residential programs, and lifting solutions as we have in other aspects of healthy housing, and to understand how we can use this to create a consistency. So we have a pretty deep design that includes a community-driven and community-led engagement in the intake and assessment phase, in our intervention or follow-up, and how we disseminate our practices. It's going to take us about 36 months of work to do all of this, pull it together, create an evaluation plan, and start to disseminate policy briefs on solutions. And so we will do that by working with families over a 3-month period during the intervention, and then doing follow-up. And this will allow us to more strongly include the ability to prevent injury into what we're already doing in our health and safety assessments, our energy audits, and our embedded resident education. So strengthening that comprehensive nature, and then using a feedback loop with families in every instance of what we are doing, why it's important, whether we've passed or failed on this, the next steps that we will do, and including their feedback on education, on improvement, and on barriers that they're seeing, feeling in the work. A lot of our work, people immediately feel that, whether it's the indoor air quality, the extreme heat, extreme cold work, improving the indoor environment. And so through this portion of the work will be 19 modification measures that we will choose from to include in our other work. So I think, Jonathon, I did that within the 20-minute or 10-minute time frame, and I hope I did, because I can talk a dog off a meat wagon.
Thank you very, very much, Ruth Ann. We really appreciate that, and thank you for your work. It's always enlightening to hear how you and GHHI are making a difference in people's lives. And now, while her presentation is fresh in your mind, please do chat in questions. We are going a little long because we were told we have a little more time, and so we want you to stick around in order to hear our next and last presentation, and then our breakout rooms as well. And I'll actually take a little bit of the chair's liberty to ask the first question. So, Ruth Ann, what is your feeling about what's termed braiding funding from different sources to be able to overcome some of the barriers that you identified when people's homes need fixes before efficiency work can be done, and if efficiency programs don't have the remit to do those fixes or the money, then the energy efficiency work doesn't get done, as we both know. And so it can be complicated, though, to combine money from different sources to do that. And we're having some of these kinds of conversations at DOE as the infrastructure money is anticipated, shall we say. And so I really would be interested to hear your thoughts about how that might be able to take place more smoothly.
Well, I will say that I had a conversation yesterday with Tony Evers, the governor of Wisconsin, on this very issue of a lot of money getting ready to flow and how states can best be prepared to align and braid. We are not, say, blending. It is braiding. And how do you sequence? How do you integrate? One of the important things here is on the workforce capacity and the contractor capacity to be able to work across the goals of these grant programs. And so weatherization contractors being trained on lead, on asthma reduction, on injury prevention, and being able to do that as a larger kind of general contractor. Two things are really important there. One, it will drive more contractors to the work to be able to have a wider scope and therefore a more stable economic environment for them. It also, by a study that we did with the Center for Employment Opportunities in our work in Buffalo, showed that those contractors will start at a $4,000 to $8,000 tick up from their peers, which is really critically important in the workforce capacity build. But our work in healthcare and what has driven now hundreds of millions of dollars of healthcare dollars going into the work of occupied housing has been both the opportunity to address the social and structural determinants of health and those and housing, which has been a detriment to equity in this country, and their opportunity to fill the gap so that, we did a paper, as you may recall, Jonathon, about a decade ago that showed in major cities in the US, if you do not address health-based housing issues, health and safety, 62% of the time, lowest income families will be deferred or declined and get lost in the system. That's expensive for DOE, it's expensive for the local agency, and it's extraordinarily costly to the families. And this is especially true for our older adults and where we have vulnerable kids. So we've identified ways to bring in private sector dollars that have less restriction to wrap around the federal dollars that are coming down and be the glue, right? And be able to be the flex dollars that fix that broken stair tread so the contractor can go in to address the mold, mildew, and moisture issues or the ceiling issues that are necessary so that our weatherization and energy efficiency investments don't degrade. And more importantly, to start to address the issues that are going to be needed so that we can get gas stoves, for example, out of housing, because that is a major culprit on asthma as well, and be able to address what is going to be necessary structurally in those houses as we pull out one set of mechanicals and put in something new. And in our lowest income communities, we often are having to gird things in houses that aren't covered by the grants. And it allows us to look at that, to bring bank dollars and bring health dollars to coincide with HUD and DOE especially. And
Great, thank you so much for that.
I hope HUD, Housing Urban Development, DOE is you, part of energy.
Thank you again, Ruth Ann, for your presentation, for answering the question, and for your work. It is truly appreciated.
Anybody wants to talk about it offline, Jonathon, two things. We are doing a study on racial equity impacts and how you measure that. People are interested, please contact me. And I'm happy to answer the question that's in the chat offline. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, and now we're going to move on to our last speaker, and in the interest of time, we're going to just go straight away to Kelley Dennings, who is a campaigner with the nonprofit Center for Biological Diversity, where she develops and executes campaigns focused on rights-based solutions to address the effects of population pressure and inequitable consumption on the environment. Prior to the center, she worked as a local government recycling coordinator, then worked for North Carolina's Department of Environment and Natural Resources before moving to the nonprofit sector, where she worked with Keep America Beautiful and the American Forest Foundation. She is the founding president of the Social Marketing Association of North America, which works to advance behavior change for social good. Her case studies have been published in multiple journals, and she's been published in Ms. Magazine, EcoWatch, and Resource Recycling. And in 2018, she won Milbank's Social Marketing Award for Innovation in the environmental field, and has other accolades as well, and other publications that we do not have time to mention, but an impressive background all the way around. And so with that, we are pleased to be able to introduce Kelley Dennings and turn the floor over to her. Kelley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hopefully folks are seeing my screen. So my name is Kelley Dennings. My pronouns are she and her. And I want to acknowledge that I'm on stolen Choctaw land where many individuals face displacement and suffering, and I hope one day they receive restorative measures. For those of you that are unable to see right now or watch us, I'm a petite, white, middle-aged woman with long brown hair standing in my living room. So the center is a national nonprofit conservation organization that works through a combination of science, the law, organizing, and creative media to protect wildlife and the wild places they need to thrive. On the screen, you're seeing all of our different programs. So I don't need to tell this audience about the current and future impacts of climate change, be that sea level rise, wildfires, or extreme heat, and the associated health impacts. Not only will it impact our environment, but the health effects will include asthma from air pollution, as you've just heard about, vector-borne disease, food insecurity, and mental health disorders. And those affected will be the ones who haven't been responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions, but deal with the disproportionate burden of an unjust polluting system. So while we have to stop using fossil fuels, transform what we eat, hold polluting corporations accountable, we also need to be more aware of how population pressure is impacting wildlife and others. So there are nearly 8 billion people on the planet today, and 50 years ago, there were about half as many. So we have our work to be done. So even though the US does have a low fertility rate, every child born here has an outsized impact on the planet. The United States is 5% of the world's population, but emits 15% of the world carbon emissions, and half of all pregnancies in the United States are unintended. So even though our fertility rate is not as high as those in other nations, we still have a lot of work to do to take full responsibility for our reproductive futures. So our philosophy empowers people, supports resilience, improves health outcomes, and reduces pressure on the environment. When we talk about this, we take a human rights lens, and it's done with justice and equity in mind. But let's be clear, the center denounces any type of population control, coercion, eco-fascism, genocide, eugenics, or closing of borders. So for those of you working on climate change, you're probably familiar with Project Drawdown. Well, it lists education of women and girls and access to family planning as top climate change solutions. So women with more years of education have fewer and healthier children and actively manage their reproductive health. And educated girls realize higher wages and greater upward mobility. We're working on a project related to municipal climate action plans and these strategies. And in the informational interviews I've done, a lot of people say that they assumed that this solution was just related to the global South, but I'm here to kind of tell you that there's work to be done here also. So switching gears a little bit to our behavior change focus, as you heard, that's also kind of my background. So merging various social and behavior change frameworks, you can see that we identified our problems as patriarchy, capitalism, racism, and other systems of oppression. So this kind of comes from the behavioral economics framework, the problem identification section. And there's a lot here in this chart. I'm not going to go through it, but I do hope you take the time to come back later and look at it in the recording. So the outcome we seek is gender empowerment, and the behavior we seek is to increase awareness of and advocacy for gender empowerment solutions, which also just happen to be good for the environment. So one of our segmented audiences, which is a tenet of social marketing, is to segment your audiences, would be other environmental groups like those of you on this call. So be that climate change groups, environmental education, or conservation groups, we're looking to work with other folks within our peer group. This is an example of our persona we created, which is a strategy kind of taken from design thinking. So research that we've conducted over the last few years includes design thinking ideation session, a national survey, a message testing survey, and an online organizational scan. So I'm going to dive into just a sliver of that now. So last year, the center published a report analyzing the awareness, attitudes, behavioral intention, and norms around these topics I just mentioned. If you want further information about the statistical validity, please message me or see us in the breakout groups. I'm not sure if we'll have time for that. I'll go over a portion of just the results today that revolve around gender empowerment, but rest assured, we also asked about consumption as we see it as two sides of the same coin. I'll have a resources slide at the end that includes a link to the full report. So in relationship to climate change, we asked what the top benefit was to addressing US population growth. And folks understand that it helps to lower greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. 71% of respondents somewhat or strongly agree that human population growth is making climate change worse. And this was a 14% increase over 2013 survey results. A new question we added to the survey was state your agreement or disagreement with the sentence, climate change compels Americans to choose to have fewer children. And 33% somewhat or strongly agree with this statement. So these two topics are already being linked in people's mind. The first question of the survey asked respondents to rank what issue was most important to them. And you can see from these results that healthcare was the most critically important issue, and that was before COVID, with the climate crisis a close second. And again, we know that they are linked, as we also just heard from the previous speaker. So everyone has the right to choose if and when they want children and how many, but that personal choice is influenced by factors including systemic racism, healthcare access, sex education, equity, and cultural pressures. As we work on these solutions, it's important to keep in mind reproductive healthcare is riddled with inequalities. In the environmental movement, we must embrace those basic rights and support the struggle for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to have good healthcare in a safe environment. And over 2/3 of our survey respondents somewhat or strongly agree that immigrants, people of color, and other marginalized communities disproportionately lack access to healthcare. So not only did we want to learn what people thought, we wanted to learn what they were doing. So this slide sums up 6 questions that were in the survey. We asked about advocating for federal and state contraceptive policy and local sex ed policy. So here you can see who said they're currently doing a behavior and who said that they're willing to do the action, some of which needed more information before acting. But this shows the intention behavior gap, and the center's goal is to create campaigns to help overcome that gap. So what are our next steps? Well, internally, we want to talk about how environmental degradation impacts human health because healthcare was the most important thing to survey responders, and our organizational scan showed how the healthcare groups regularly talk about the solutions that we advocate for. We also want to educate people about the issues so they can increase their advocacy, but do it with messages that are more inclusive, sensitive, and less harmful. We want to change from downstream adaptation-focused policies to solution-oriented, people-centric policies. So hopefully I'm bringing some of the utopian message here. So what if we were to think about contraception as a technology like solar panels, rapid bus transit, or building retrofits? And the solutions are straightforward. We want to advocate for increased access to reproductive health care, comprehensive sex education, and women's empowerment and bodily autonomy. And we need to do this by addressing systemic barriers like patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy using a justice lens that considers the structural inequities that impact this work. So each of these underlines the problematic advocacy that we've seen so far, and we need to confront it to move forward to address the real problems that advance human rights and justice. So just to end, I'm showing some resources on the screen in case you want to learn more. I can add them to the chat. And please click on the survey via the link or put your phone up to the QR code and you can answer some of our survey questions, which we're always continuing to accept, and do a short evaluation. I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, thank you, Kelley. Thank you very much for giving your time today. And now is the time while her presentation is fresh in your mind to chat questions. And I'm going to share some questions that people have chatted in. I'll just add that people, all this, of course, is people, let's see, I'll just read the questions and let Kelley make of it what she may, as opinions are their own. Let's see. Lisa asks, Kelley, fantastic work. I'm curious about your list of problems and if you have further clarification of let's see, further clarification of problems and if you have further clarification of alternatives to, for example, capitalism as a system of oppression, and I'm guessing you have received some pushback on that.
Yeah, so on the capitalism side of things, we have, like, I wear two hats. So I live in the reproductive health rights and justice movement, but I also live in kind of the consumption waste movement. So there's a framework. You've probably heard of the circular economy. Perhaps you've heard of donut economics. There's another one that we really like called the solidarity economy. So the circular economy mostly focuses on the products. The donut economy will bring in some of those social aspects, and it understands that there's kind of a justice and equity component to it. But if you look up the solidarity economy, it goes even further than that. And it's about building our economic system with kind of democracy, pluralism, cooperation. So, you know, co-ops would be an example of a solidarity economy framework, or unions, you know, bringing in the labor movement. And so, yeah, so I'm over here working in that world along with those stuff I just showed. So we do need to address both. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, we have another question. Claudia says, I admit this perspective occurred to me in reference to the proposed child tax credit. Without sustainability message, this proposal, and I'm reading this verbatim, this proposal suggests population growth is not problematic, although I'll never forget how focus on population limits by the Sierra Club almost destroyed the organization.
Yes. So thank you for this question. One, in relationship to kind of the history of the Sierra Club comment here, if you understand that. So we see immigration as a human right. So that's why I mentioned we don't see closing of borders as a solution to this, because when we talk about this issue on a global scale, which is the same with climate change, right? You know, having people stay in their certain countries does not help us on a global scale. Related to the child tax credit. So we've not seen any data that shows that a child tax credit is incentivizing people to have more children. And by removing a child tax credit, it would actually harm those folks that legitimately need it. And so, you know, we don't want to hurt those that need it and, you know, those that are already disproportionately impacted by these systems of oppression. So, and again, we're not really seeing that is making a change. There are some countries that have lowering fertility rates that are doing something called a baby bonus. And, you know, the research is still a little bit out on that, but a child tax credit is totally different from that. And, you know, that kind of relates to, you know, the one-child policies and things, the more coercive policies, which is why we focus on just the human rights and justice components of giving folks bodily autonomy and gender empowerment, which once we have that, let's see if we still have a problem. But since we don't have that in this country, I say we work on that.
So last question as we hit the top of the hour, you know, just we've touched in this session a little bit on motivations and everything else being equal, which is, you know, quite an assumption to be sure. What is your feeling about what motivates people to take positive action?
Is that for me still? Sorry. Or
Yeah.
were you opening it up? I hope that we see that we can make impact by the individual actions we take, but we know that we have to live within this larger systemic issue. So we get that pushback a lot when we work on like individual consumption, and it's like, oh, but 70% of, you know, GHGs is coming from these 100 polluters. Yes, we understand that, but we still have the ability to change and advocate with those 100 polluters. And personally, I would not wake up every day if I didn't have the ability to make change or make impact. So hopefully that helps. We need to work. It's an and, but it's an and also kind of thing.
Okay. Well, I think, Kelley, that gives you the last word at our session. And thank you, everybody, for sticking with us as we have had such good interaction. We have gone well over our original time.